And all of a sudden, I was staring at a Zoom room of like 10 people of Asian descent. And never in my life had I had the experience of being with people who looked like me and who understood me and my experiences all at once. And, afterwards, someone said to me, like, do you know what you said there in that room? They said you felt like you were home. And from there, I knew that I wanted to create a place of belonging for all Asians who are working in psychedelics.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Adventures of the Psyche. This episode, we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month and are honored to feature guest Simran Sethi, who will share about her work fostering a culture of belonging, healing, and empowerment for Asians working with psychedelics. Simran is the founder of the Asian Psychedelic Collective. She's a journalist, an academic, birth doula, and yoga teacher. And she's also a member of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion team at the American Psychedelic Practitioner Association. She was part of the inaugural equity cohort at Fireside Project and is a 2023 Ferriss-UC Berkeley Psychedelic Journalism Fellow. Thanks so much for joining us, Simran.
Thank you.
Let's start with you telling us about the APC, the Asian Psychedelic Collective. When and how did it get started? Why? And what are the main types of events and gatherings you're holding?
So there are three parts to the origin story of APC. First part was being in the ceremony and being with a wonderful group of people, but being the only person of Asian descent and not having any cultural touchstone or anybody who I felt could understand my lived experience as an immigrant to the United States of South Asian descent. And then from there, being in a psychedelic justice class and having, I think it was maybe even a joke, but it didn't land that way at all. Having a professor say, talking in the context of trauma, in a class around diversity and inclusion and psychedelics, saying, well, y'all East Asians don't have anything to worry about. And I'm of South Asian descent, but I just remember rearing up and being like, hold up. Like, do you actually think like there's no trauma in the Asian community? Like, that was really hard for me to hear. And then there was a third piece. So it's kind of feeling like invisible and kind of disregarded. And then having this transformative experience at Fireside Project. Fireside trained a cohort of equity volunteers that were trained to support trans folks, veterans, and BIPOC who are tripping or integrating a past psychedelic experience. And we had a moment where the BIPOC cohort broke down into a smaller cohort. And all of a sudden, I was staring at a Zoom room of like 10 people of Asian descent. And never in my life had I had the experience of being with people who looked like me and who understood me and my experiences all at once. And I wanted that experience for all Asian people. I wanted that sense of not only homecoming, but a depth of healing and understanding that I wasn't finding in the broader community. So that's sort of the kind of clunky origin story of APC. And then what we offer are, is a real attempt to create a culture of care, a community of care, a space of belonging. And our work is built on three pillars, which are community, education, and advocacy for Asians in the space. Sometimes when people hear advocacy, they think about advocacy for psychedelics, but we're advocating for having a seat at the table and being seen in this space. So, and being acknowledged for the work that we're already doing here. So, the community piece is around offering integration circles. Also, ones where we don't have to choose one identity over another, honoring our intersections. So our LGBTQIA plus circle, our women femme circle, our men's circle, our immigrant first generation circle, which I am an immigrant. So that was the first circle that we launched with. We also have a grief circle where we address cultural bereavement and, so much of what's been buried in our culture as we've tried to assimilate to Western culture. And then around our education piece, our commitment to harm reduction is really strong. And we're grateful that we have an offering that was created initially as the Asian American Drug War Healing Circle, developed by Rana Hashemi and Xingyi Fu, who have now brought this offering to the Asian Psychedelic Collective as the Asian Drug War Healing Circle, where we explore the impacts of the war on drugs, the impacts of the stigmatization of drug use in our community, and how we can come together and heal and understand. And what we also hope to develop are, educational materials around how to talk to your Asian family members about psychedelics. In Mandarin, there's not a word for psychedelic, and then we look at a place like, India, where like cannabis is part of our healing tradition. One of our gods, Shiva, is actually, works with bhang, with cannabis. So to achieve, an altered state of being. And so there's so many examples of this that we want to also elevate to remind people that altered states of consciousness are very much part of our faith traditions, our philosophies, our healing traditions. Some of them, of course, we see show up in the West, which, I'm happy to expand on. But then in addition to that this is our birthright, that we belong here. So that's part of the education piece. We also have a book club that we're starting, and then there's, of course, the advocacy piece, which is how do we ensure that we are, acknowledged as a people, as a community that needs support and that also needs recognition. So, we are underrepresented in clinical trials. We are underrepresented in psychedelic, practitioner trainings. We are underrepresented in ceremony spaces. We are underrepresented in clinical spaces. We are underrepresented in leadership positions. And the folks of Asian descent who are there, we're not like culturally so good at waving our pom-poms and saying like, we're here. So APC is going to step up and let folks know that we're here and hopefully shine a light on the extraordinary folks of Asian descent who are doing the work. And also as part of that, developing and launching in the fall, a mentorship program for, folks who want to move into educational opportunities and professional opportunities in this space. How can we support each other and ensure that, people are able to move into this space with a level of comfort that maybe they haven't yet experienced.
I understand you started this org because of your own personal experiences. Can you tell us how that happened? What led you to doing this?
Right. So that's like the backstory to the backstory that I just mentioned. I haven't shared this story publicly in this way before. And I think it's really important to do because I mentioned the stigmatization of drug use in our community. And I say our in this like very expansive broad way, right? Asians are the largest population on the planet. 2 out of 3 people on the planet are of Asian descent. And we're the fastest fastest growing ethno-racial group in the United States. So there's a lot of us. And I recognize that I'm not speaking for everyone. But what I can say is there's a lot of resonance across Asian communities, South, East, West, Central, diaspora, bicultural or multicultural. So when I share in this way, what I want to say is like, not only is drug use stigmatized in our community, but so are mental health challenges. And you asked, how did this happen? And it happened through my own challenges, managing depression and anxiety that put me into a really, what I had been able to manage, I could no longer manage between the pandemic and just everything that's been going on in the world, from ethno-racial violence to climate change, and biodiversity loss, which are key components of what I've spent much of my life looking at. And just the general sense that things were getting worse, not better. And, got to that place where I was holding, the pills in my hand, figuring out how many I needed to take to end my life. And, what I'm grateful and happy to say is that I held on to that moment and remembered when I grew my own mushrooms, for healing, that those same hands, that wanted to sort of like contemplate ending life, like all of a sudden I was holding this psilocybin mushroom that had helped me get my life back. And so that's really where this work started, was recognizing the power of psychedelics from as a storyteller and a journalist, like from that perspective, I was like, okay. And, focused on science and environmentalism. I was like, oh, okay, I understand like the, neuroplasticity and the quieting of the default mode network. Like I had a very cerebral understanding of what would happen in a psychedelic experience, because the ones I had had until that had been like, just to kind of have fun, recreationally. I'd never moved into this work with that explicit desire to heal. And I showed up in such dire, desperate need of healing. At that point, I was like, okay, I've read all the studies from Hopkins. I am ready to embark on this experience, but what I didn't know was that I would feel, communion with my father, who has passed on, who I hadn't felt his presence in like 8 years since he had passed away. I guess at that point it was 7 years. Or forgiveness, from myself. Communion with my ancestors has always been the through line for my experiences. And so that was, in such a powerful way, the place where this started, because I want this liberation for my people. We are a population that has endured so much that doesn't get talked about. I was, immigrated to the United States, but went through the public school system here. And you're not going to hear much about Asians in the United States, much less Asians in Asia. You're not going to hear about the impacts of partition. My father walking from Pakistan to India, the largest mass migration in history, and largest and most violent. You're not going to hear about the trauma of the Korean War. You're not going to hear about, the trauma of, the Afghan War. You're not going to hear about these things. Everything gets buried. You're not going to hear about even the challenges South Asians faced after 9/11, everything that's happened with East Asian community, through COVID. The largest, I think, and last mass lynching in the United States was of Chinese people. Like, these are the things that people don't recognize. And I know there's a lot of traumas that we need to be addressing, but I think, like, as a culture, we bury things. We don't talk about things because these things bring shame upon our family. And then on top of that, no one here knows about it. So nobody's going to ask you, how are you feeling? Like, that's not going to happen. So it's just like, it keeps getting buried. It keeps getting hidden. And then we don't know how to ask for help. So there's just a lot there that keeps us from actually accessing the kind of support that we need. So that's why I think it's important to share that, like, the way I got here was through a very rocky path.
Thank you. Psychedelics are not the solution for everyone, but they should be available and accessible to all. This is a great quote from your article in Double Blind that I got a sneak preview of, where you also speak of the rampant decontextualization, erasure, and decoupling of the origins of Asian faith, traditions, and philosophies that really impede beneficial psychedelic therapy. So would you please expand on this?
Yeah, we talk so much about set and setting, and obviously that's critical, but I also really appreciate what, psychotherapist Betty Eisner referenced as matrix, which is, that we come from a place and we will go to a place. And that's part of this experience. So, what has been painful are the ways in which Asian culture has become conflated with psychedelic ceremony. So the soundtrack that's meant to be benign background music will be like a Sikh mantra, like a chant. But that's gibberish for someone who doesn't know the language. But this girl knows the language. That's a chant my grandmother used to chant. When I see a Buddha in the corner or a Ganesh on the altar that's just sort of decoupled and separated from any context of where these things came from, it lands already in a kind of a funny way. And I want to just say, like, I don't think it's intentional. I do think a lot of this is just oversight, but these are part of my lineage. And growing up in the United States, so much of my lived experience has been erased until it is repackaged and returned to me through a Western like route, right? So like yoga is now something you do like to get tight abs or to make a bunch of money. But like, how many people are actually reminding folks like this tradition comes from India, or and kind of the complexity of that, or folks talking about Ram Dass, but not acknowledging like that was the name given to him by his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, right? Like that is like everything kind of gets re-Westernized, and the people that get elevated, like the meditation teacher, like it's not Vipassana meditation, it's insight meditation. And let me tell you about the like, the Anglo teacher who's going to deliver this to you. And you're going to mispronounce every one of these words and not actually know what Sikhism is or Buddhism is or Hinduism is, but you're going to take it. You're going to take a piece of that works for you, and you're just going to discard the rest, right? And you're not going to like think about like the pain of folks who have had that erased, had their culture shamed, had that stuff taken from them. You're not going to necessarily do anything when they are on the receiving end of violence, but you are going to go down to that yoga studio, and do your poses. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. And there's a little edge coming up in my voice, but I do want to say, like, I genuinely think I want this healing for all of us. But what I also want for all of us is an honoring of the places where the medicines come from and where the traditions that we embed into these practices to amplify healing come from.
To build off what you were saying earlier, how beautiful it was to suddenly be in a Zoom room with 10 other Asians, it seems really powerful. And so I'm curious, what does that look like when you're in a BIPOC space?
I'm so glad you asked that. It's an interesting thing. Here's why. Like, after I've had these medicine experiences where I was like, okay, these folks don't know what I just went through. And also like, I'm feeling a little, something because the music was this or the. I went to BIPOC circles and I definitely felt a greater sense of comfort and belonging, but I was still I was the only person of Asian descent in my ceremonies. And I was the only person of Asian descent in these BIPOC spaces. And I mean, I'm not saying that happens all the time at all. And I've definitely had experiences where there was one more of us, but I think it's a tricky thing because a lot of what, the conversations around trauma look like in public are on more of a black-white binary. And there are so many important conversations that need to happen around what is happening in African-American communities and the need to offer a lot more support. But I also recognize that when we're in these spaces where like we're supposed to cover everybody else, it's like non-white, right? It's like Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And I've already just said like 2 out of 3 people on the planet are Asian. So all of us are all of a sudden supposed to be in this bucket. And again, we disappear, and so I think like there is a need for more nuanced, culturally attuned is the term that Terrence Ching uses. He's a postdoc at Yale and has written so beautifully about being at that intersection of being both queer and of Asian descent, and working with MDMA during the clinical trials that he was part of. And I love this term culturally attuned care, that he offers, because I think it's really important. And that's why I felt like there was a need to go further, to go beyond BIPOC, where we absolutely have solidarity with our brothers and sisters and family of color, but that we deserve our own space too, because Black trauma, as one example, is not the same as Asian trauma. There are specificities and nuances that absolutely must be addressed around, in our community, there's so much around face, around being the quote unquote model minority that's supposed to like be okay. and that puts us in opposition with other communities, which is just really, really wrong because it erases our individuality. And it also sort of makes it seem like we're okay, but the reality is the biggest economic disparity within the country is within the Asian community, right? So it's like, we're not all universally doctors or, whatever. And then also we're not universally okay. So I think that that's why it's so critical that we have our BIPOC spaces, but that we also each have a space of our own.
And so when it comes to mental health in Asian American populations, you don't hear so much about it. But according to a study done by the National Alliance on Mental Illness, I was surprised to learn that suicide is the leading cause of death among Asian Americans aged 20 to 24 years old, responsible for about 33% of deaths in that age bracket. Can you tell me more, please?
Well, just that it's heartbreaking, and it shocked me too, that statistic. Asian Americans are 3 times less likely than Caucasian Americans to seek help for mental health challenges, and that we are the group least likely to seek mental health support overall. There was a study that was done in 2020 we get Pacific Islanders also get kind of put together in this category, but they represent a very small portion of the AAPI community. But that, what that survey showed was that just 20% of Asian Americans with mental health issues were seeking treatment. And that goes kind of back to what I was just touching into, which is face is a real thing, right? That's sort of more of an East Asian term, like that we need to preserve a perception that we're okay. And this came up even just yesterday, talking to my family about what we call shut-em, which is shame, that one of the worst things you can do is talk about something messy, is to give the perception that things are not okay, that it's really important. And, it's not only something that we think of as like being like, we want to project an image, but that we want to find a way to keep ourselves safe. And we don't want to draw too much attention to ourselves, because to do that is to bring, it feels like a little bit of an uneasy thing culturally. And that's part of the reason like APC is about advocacy, because it's like, we're not going to draw attention and say, hey, we're here. And so yeah, I think for me, you asked the question of like, what do I think of this? And I think like, it's a tragedy. And the thing that I find most tragic is that like, there's sort of this, what Jenny Wang, a psychologist who wrote a beautiful book about Asian mental health, says is like, it's a code of privacy, and that makes us even more hesitant to reach out for help, because we don't want to expose family secrets. We don't want to make things messy for our family. We don't want to make things harder for anybody. So it seems like it's just easier to keep quiet. But, as you see from the statistic that you shared, like it comes at too high of a cost.
I think simply like getting the word out the way you are is really what's going to help illuminate, allow more space for healing and less shame. When we see you, a successful Asian American out there doing amazing things or talking about this without your own shame, you're empowering everyone else. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that.
Yeah. And so on that note, how can our viewers support and help the APC? How can we be a part of this?
Okay, well, if you're of Asian descent, and I mean big A Asian, because I don't know how we ended up saying East Asian's Asian and, South Asian something else, and South Asian doesn't mean Afghanistan. Like it's crazy. I don't know who did that, but part of our work is retelling that story, reclaiming our medicines, reclaiming our healing, reclaiming our big community. So if you're of Asian descent, Asian Psychedelic Collective.org is the place to go. Sign up for our mailing list so you can hear about all of our offerings. Come to one of our integration circles or our grief circle or our drug war healing circle. We're also starting to do in-person events. So we've had one in-person in New York, we're gonna have one in Denver, and we're gonna also hold events in Los Angeles, Boston, and Washington, DC, sometime over the next several months. And please donate. This is a labor of love. Everyone's a volunteer. I have put my own money and thousands of hours into this because I want this liberation for our people. And I hope folks will join us and, follow us on Instagram. Share with friends and just recognize that, like, even if you're not of Asian descent, that every time you come across an offering that includes something from a place that maybe isn't here, and you recognize that as being Asian, mention it, or just give thanks in your heart. But just helping to build a culture where we feel a sense of belonging, not only within the Asian community, but within the broader community, right? Because that's my dream. My dream is that I wouldn't feel othered, and when I say I don't just mean me. In order to create the organization and come up with those pillars that I referenced, it was like talking to over 100 people. But just recognize like that there is a longing to belong. And that starts with really feeling welcome.
Thank you so much, Simran. Such a joy having you.
Thank you. Likewise.